So I think it's 3:30 and we are back. Interesting with the WebEx that we can be back almost instantly, and there's no cajoling certain audience members to return to their seats and conclude their conversations. But here we are. Our next topic and our final topic is our foundational market design element, or our EDAM education topic, on congestion in the EIM and the day-ahead markets. And
if I may interject, Candace, have you opened up the phone lines?
Yes, I have.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we are back. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So, and this topic emerged out of the EDAM workshop, where the concepts and underpinnings of congestion were one of the areas where it was clear that stakeholders needed some additional opportunity to explore the concept and address some of the fundamentals of the market design as it is today, so that we can really focus and frame the conversation as part of the EDAM stakeholder process moving forward. And in order to really ground us, we have Susan Pope from FTI Consulting to give us our keynote presentation. Susan Pope is a managing director in FTI Consulting's Boston office, specializing in the economic and public policy analysis of electricity markets. She played key roles in the formation of the New York ISO, the California ISO, and the Mid-Continent ISO, and she has also done substantial work on the electricity market designs in PJM, ERCOT, and ISO New England. She is currently engaged in the redesign of electricity markets in Ontario, and Susan has an AB in applied math and a PhD in business economics from Harvard. I think we are very lucky to have Susan with us today to really talk about the fundamentals of congestion, which is certainly one of the topics I personally have could really benefit from more information and more grounding on. So with that, I will turn it over to Susan. Nikki has her presentation up, and I think we're ready to go.
Thank you, Pam, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to the forum. This presentation is going to be down in the weeds, but I think the information is, as Pam said, fundamental to understanding congestion and LMP. So my understanding, and tell me if I'm wrong, Pam, is that I have 45 minutes, so I am just going to dive in here. Next slide, please. So this first slide is an overview of the content of the presentation. You're really not supposed to do this when you present, but what I have here is really a summary of the takeaways. Directing your attention to the blue arrows first, they really show the flow of the presentation. I'm going to first explain how the system operator's job of managing transmission system reliability inevitably leads to the need to address transmission congestion. And the general first-tier response to congestion is to adjust the dispatch of flexible suppliers so as to change the flows on the transmission system so that they don't violate transmission constraints. The final link, this fourth arrow here, is the explanation of how locational prices arise, or to put it differently, how they're determined by the bids and offers of the resources that the system operator redispatches to address congestion. So now, drawing your attention to the gray boxes here, this is a little more detail about the more specific takeaways in each section of the presentation. Over on the left-hand gray box addresses the fact that at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to look at how the management of transmission reliability inevitably has to deal with the physical properties of the transmission grid And the key concepts there that I want to explain are parallel flow and the role of transmission constraints. I'll talk a little bit about contingency analysis and then drop that topic. Transmission congestion arises as a natural consequence of reliably operating the system at least cost in the presence of parallel flows and transmission constraints. So as the system operator dispatches or redispatches at least cost, congestion occurs because of these parallel flows and transmission constraints. And the illustrations will show how the nature of the transmission congestion can vary over time. It can occur at different levels of load. It will change as imports and exports change, or depending on the availability of different supply and grid resources. So we'll touch on that briefly. The main tool that's available, as I said, to the system operator to manage congestion is to dispatch or redispatch the flexible generators on the system. So in the presentation, I've used kind of this cumbersome terminology, redispatch with parentheses around it. And I've done that on purpose to recognize that there are variations in electricity market design. So in some electricity markets, the dispatch is for 100% of the generation to serve all load. That's a full economic of all generation to serve load. In others, like in your EIM, the dispatch is really a balancing market dispatch. So it's a balancing dispatch to correct imbalances and manage congestion, and that's what the RE there means. So it's a redispatch as opposed to a full dispatch. In either case, these occur based on the voluntary offers and bids of suppliers and loads. So moving to the last gray box here, locational marginal prices for energy and congestion pricing arise naturally from the economic dispatch that's done to maintain transmission reliability. So what I'm hoping to show you through a simple example is how you can directly calculate and see what the locational prices are once you understand how the system has been dispatched in order to manage congestion. So the locational prices differ, as you know, by location, depending on where generation is more valuable because it's located advantageously relative to transmission constraints, or, for example, load might be more expensive to serve because it's difficult to get generation to the load because of transmission constraints. The illustrations will talk a little bit and show you how the differences between LMPs at two locations arise from the differences in the value of the energy due to transmission congestion. So next slide, please. The next few slides are going to talk about two key aspects of transmission grid operations. This slide shows you a picture of parallel flow, which is an aspect of transmission operation that falls out of a law of physics called Kirchhoff's law. So parallel flow is a property of the transmission grid in which energy flowing between an injection point, which is A here in this illustration, and a withdrawal point, which is C here, naturally splits and flows on all of the parallel paths. There are only two parallel paths here, but all of the parallel paths between the source location, here it's A, and the sink location C. And the way that the power flows between the source and the sink along these parallel paths is determined by the physical properties of the transmission lines. Specifically, it depends on the impedance of the transmission lines. And impedance is a concept, it's a product of both resistance and the reactance of the lines, I think best in terms of resistance. So all of the blue lines in the figure that you're shown here, these all have equal impedance. So according to Kirchhoff's laws, the way that the transmission flows from A to C will work here is in inverse proportion to the total impedance of the two paths. So one path, the A to B to C path, is twice as long as the short path from A to C. So what this means is that 1/3 of any megawatt injected at A is going to flow on the A to B to C path, and 2/3 will flow on the A to C path. This happens. This is a physical concept that transmission system operators have to manage. They don't have any dials or gates or things that they can open and close to change this on the AC transmission grid. This just automatically happens. Next slide, please. So just focusing on the left-hand panel for the moment, parallel flow on the transmission grid means that the transmission capacity between two locations, or you can also think of it as across an interface or a flow gate, isn't fixed. The pictures, which I'll explain in a minute on this slide, show that the quantity of energy that can flow to a load depends on the locations of the injections and the withdrawals on the grid, even when all transmission elements are in service. So just looking at the left-hand picture for a moment, you've got the same three transmission bus system here with the same three equal impedance lines, and there is a 600 megawatt transmission limit on the line from B to C. And what this first picture shows is that if you're trying to get power to load at C from the injection node at node B, the most you can deliver to the load at C is 900 megawatts. So the reason this occurs is because of the parallel flows of Kirchhoff's laws, whereby the 900 megawatts is going to divide so that 1/3 of it flows on the long path and 2/3 of it flows on the short path from B to C. So you can only get 600 megawatts across that transmission limit, which means you can only put 900 megawatts of power in at node B to meet load at C. However, if you have instead generation located at A, you can serve 1,800 megawatts of load at C. So the illustration here shows that the amount of power, or the capacity to move power down to load at C on this transmission grid, or on any, and this of course generalizes, depends on the location of the generation that you're trying to serve the load with, and where the transmission constraints exist on the system. The other thing I want you to note about this example is that both of these pictures show a transmission flows right up against the 600 megawatt transmission limit between B and C. So there's congestion in both of these illustrations, even though there's very different levels of load on the system here. So although this is a really simple example, it's just kind of a launch pad to make the point that the existence of congestion on the transmission system depends very much on, how much load you have, where that load is located, where you've got generation coming into the system, how much generation is coming in at different points, and how those are situated relative to the transmission limits on the system. So you can get transmission congestion at low levels of load, or intermediate, or higher levels of load. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about this slide and then kind of push aside one of the concepts we talk about here, but I really want you to know about it. So as you saw on the preceding page, transmission congestion arises from the interaction of parallel flows on the grid with transmission constraints. So again, just focusing on the left-hand gray panel for a moment, just wanted to talk through that the types of transmission limits typically observed during transmission system operation consist of thermal limits, voltage limits, and stability limits. Voltage and stability limits are typically represented as interface limits or nomograms that are executed in the base case power flow. Here I want to talk for just a minute about thermal limits. So thermal limits are typically managed on a contingency basis. And what that means is that the way that the transmission system is operated is so that if a major failure occurs, the transmission system will still be operating reliably. It won't burn down. It's just like, actually once when I was going from Boston to Albany for the NISO, one of the engines went out on my airplane, and the airplane still flew, much to my amazement. I didn't know that that was going to happen, but it was designed for the contingency of the engine going out. So the operation of the transmission system in terms of what generation is used to meet the load is designed so that if there is a major failure on the system in terms of the failure of a generator or a transmission line going out of service, typically the transmission system will still be secure. So the reason this is important is because if there is a failure, for example, of a transmission line, the flows on the transmission system instantly redirect themselves over the other lines that haven't failed. They will instantaneously redirect themselves so that if there's a potential to overload a constraint when those flows are redirected. So in order to prevent that, the transmission system is managed so that it is, if a contingency occurs or a major failure occurs, it's still secure. So if you look at the first figure here, what you see is the pre-contingency dispatch of, here I have a 4-bus system because that's just what I happen to have for this example. And you can see that there's 1,200 megawatts of injections down here at node A to meet 1,200 megawatts of load at node C. And because all of these blue lines have the same impedance, 300 megawatts of the 1,200 megawatt injection go over each of the long paths, and 600 megawatts goes over the shorter path from A to C. So that's how the parallel flows naturally work on this 4-bus system. But the reason this system is can only take 1,200 megawatts out at C from a generator at A is because of the contingency in which the A to C line is out of service, and that's what's shown in the right-hand picture. So if this line were to go out of service and there were 1,200 megawatts being injected at A and 1,200 megawatts being withdrawn at C, the flows would instantaneously redistribute so that 600 megawatts would go on each of these longer parallel paths. And you can see that when that happens, the B to C line is up against the 600 megawatt limit. So what's important here is the observation, or one of the things that's important here is the observation that what you see in the pre-contingency picture on the left is that this B to C line is not actually against the limit. So that's what you are going to see in actual day-to-day, hour-to-hour operations transmission system. You're going to see a lot of times that the flows are beneath the limits, the thermal limits on the system. But the reason that's occurring is because the system is being operated so as to be secure in the event of a major failure. Okay, so now that's explaining what contingency constrained operation is, and now I've explained that, I'm going to simplify away from it, but that is really what's going on all the time. Okay, next slide. So now that we've covered these basic concepts of transmission operation, I want to build an example to show how congestion occurs and how locational prices are calculated. And I'm going to use a simple grid, a 3-bus grid that we've seen before with a 600 megawatt limit between B and C. And in these cases, I'm going to have a lower cost supplier offering $20 a megawatt hour at node B and a higher cost supplier offer of $40 at node A. Next slide, please. So if there were only 750 megawatts of load at node C in this example, there would be an unconstrained dispatch of the $20 supplier to meet the 750 megawatt load. So what you can see here is that if 750 megawatts are injected at node B, 250 megawatts go the long way around to node C, and 500 megawatts flow directly from B to C, and the 500 megawatts are below the 600 megawatt transmission limit. So if there are only 750 megawatts of load here, there is no transmission congestion. This is unconstrained dispatch. Next slide, please. However, and here I increase the load to 1,500 megawatts. So if load is higher than 750 megawatts, I increased it a lot, but if it's 1,500 megawatts, say in this example, it's no longer possible to serve all of the load at node C with the low-cost supplier at node B. In the picture, you can see that if you tried to inject 1,500 megawatts at B, 1,000 of those megawatts would flow on the B to C line and violate the 600 megawatt transmission limit. So this is a case with transmission congestion. It's not possible to use a least cost merit order dispatch, straight merit order dispatch to serve the load here. Instead, we need an out-of-merit dispatch, a redispatch, in order to serve 1,500 megawatts without violating the transmission constraint. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide shows the least cost redispatch to serve 1,500 megawatts of load at node C. So the most that can be supplied from the cheaper supplier, $20 supplier at node B, is 300 megawatts. So the best we can do, the lowest cost dispatch here, is 300 megawatts from the supplier at node B and 1,200 megawatts from the $40 supplier at node A. And what you can see is that with that combination of injections, we're right up against the 600 megawatt transmission limit. And the way that you can calculate this, and the reason I use these simple examples is that you can actually calculate it yourself and see what's going on here, is that the 600 megawatts that are up against the 600 megawatt limit are comprised of 400 megawatts that are coming from the injection at A. So the injection at A, of the 1,200 megawatts injected at A, 800, or rather 900, do I have this right? 900 are going, the caption at the bottom is 300. Yeah, this is actually not exactly right. But the flows, the point here is that we need the dispatch of both of these generators to observe this transmission limit, and the flows across the transmission limit are a combination of the flows from the suppliers at both A and at node B. So I think the problem here is actually this 900 megawatts in green on the A to C line needs to be 800 megawatts here, and the 400 megawatts from the A to B flow needs to be, no, actually that is 300 megawatts. And it is, yeah, it is 900 megawatts. Sorry. Okay, so this picture is right. So next slide, please. So the observations here are that the least cost dispatch based on the offers uses a mix of suppliers to meet the load. The redispatch is necessary to serve the load at C. In other words, we need to use 1,200 megawatts of the higher cost generator in order not to violate the 600 megawatt transmission limit. A small increase in injections at some locations, say injection B, rather than at another location like A, would cause the transmission limit to be exceeded. So, for example, if we tried to inject 301 megawatts at B rather than 300 and reduce the injections at node A, that 1 megawatt of incremental injection at B would cause 2/3 of a megawatt to flow across its transmission limit. So we can't put any more than 300 megawatts in at B. And what follows from that is the straightforward observation that the market value of incremental supply is more valuable at some locations, say B, than it is at A, because of this transmission limit and how it interacts with the parallel flow. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides show where the energy prices come from in this least cost dispatch. The LMPs, the red numbers here are the LMPs. And in the left-hand bar, what I've written down is the definition of LMP that I find most intuitive and that we use all the time. I think using this this definition enables you to understand the LMPs that are shown in examples like the ones that you're seeing here. So the LMP is the lowest dispatch or redispatch cost based on voluntary bids and offers of supplying energy to the next incremental load at a specific location on the transmission grid while observing all security limits. Okay? Next slide, please. So focusing on the prices at A and B, the locational price at B is $20. And this is because an incremental load can be met at lowest cost by the $20 supplier at B. So additional supply isn't worth any more than $20 at B because no more of it can be dispatched to meet the load at C. And if you had load actually located at B, it could be served at $20 under the assumption that there's additional room available on the whatever segment's being dispatched for this $20 supplier. The LMP at A is $40 because this $40 supplier can meet any load that might be located at A. The reason that the price is not $20 at node A is because this $20 supplier can't serve load at A, can't meet load at A without overloading the transmission limit. So if you try to put an injection in at B to serve load at A, some of those megawatts would flow on a parallel path from B to C to A, and would overload this 600 megawatt transmission limit. So the least cost way of serving an increment of load at A is this $40 supplier at a price of $40. Next slide, please. So the LMP at location C is the more interesting case. So the LMP here is $60, which is higher than the offers of both of the suppliers in this example. And the reason the LMP at C is $60 is because, and again, here I'm just pretty much literally applying that definition of LMP and looking at the cost, the incremental redispatch cost of meeting an incremental load of C without violating the transmission limit. And the way that occurs is through a 2 megawatt increased injection at node A plus a 1 megawatt decreased injection at node B. So if you do the calculation, that's shown in the third bullet over in the left-hand panel. The price of that the price of that redispatch of the two units combined is 2 megawatts times $40 minus 1 megawatt times $20. So there's an increase in the supply from the higher cost supplier and a decrease in the supply from the lower cost supplier. So because you've had to decrease the amount of supply from the lower cost supplier, it causes an increase in the overall cost of meeting an increment of load at node C. So the picture actually shows you the mental problem of meeting an increment of load down here at C. So you can see 1,501 megawatts down at load C, and a decrease of 1 megawatt of injection at B, and an increase of 2 megawatts at node A, and the flows that result from that, where again, we're right up against the 600 megawatt limit from nodes B to C. So the reason that there's no change in the flow on the B to C line is because a 1 megawatt reduction in injection at node B reduces the flow on that line by 2/3 of a megawatt, while a 2 megawatt increase in the injection at node A, it similarly increases the flow on that line by 2/3 of a megawatt. And that calculation is shown at the bottom of the box here. So there's a balancing of decreasing the injections from the lower cost supplier, increasing them at the higher cost supplier in order to manage flows across that constraint. And note that what you're seeing here in terms of this $60 price being different than the price of either of these suppliers is what occurs all the time in systems with locational prices, where you will see prices at nodes that can be higher than the prices of any supplier that is actually dispatched in an hour or in a 5-minute period. Similarly, this redispatch and balancing concept is why you see negative prices. So when you have to reduce the injections of a cheap supplier by a lot in order to offset the increased flows over a transmission constraint from a higher cost supplier, it can actually cause a negative price at some nodes, and we see that all the time, for example, in the western part of ERCOT. So this is obviously very simplified, but this is really the way that LMP determination or congestion pricing works on LMP systems. Obviously, I've left out of these examples the pricing of marginal losses, which occurs in, all of the centralized markets in the U.S. except for ERCOT. I've also left out the impacts of things like co-optimized reserves on locational prices. So what you see here is really just the way that the congestion component of the prices is determined. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just some observations about these LMP prices. They reflect the impact of congestion on the value of incremental energy at different locations. So the reason that incremental supply at node B is worth less than at node A is because node B causes increased supply at node B causes a lot of flow on constrained parts of the system in serving the major load center on this system. So, you see this, for example, in New York, where a lot of the generation is located in the western part of the state, and the LMPs there are lower than in the eastern part of the state because they have to flow across major transmission constraints to get there. And the more that a supplier is located at a point on the transmission system where the parallel flows that it causes over constraints that are expensive to manage are high, typically the lower value the output of that, or the lower the LMP of that supplier is going to be. You can also see that these prices, if you applied them to loads, indicate the cost on the margin of serving an increment of load at these different locations. And the difference in the prices between nodes is the congestion price of a bilateral schedule or a transmission schedule between two nodes. So, for example, if a party wanted to schedule a transmission, a bilateral transaction from node B to node C, from B to C, in this dispatch, the congestion price charged for that transaction would be $40. And that's because the value of the injection associated with that transaction is really just $20, as seen from the point of view of the alternatives for managing congestion on the system. And the cost of the withdrawal associated with the bilateral transaction is $60 because of the need to manage the transmission congestion. So to look at it another way, if a transmission, a bilateral transaction were to replace 1 megawatt of the injection to withdrawal from B to C here, the cost of redispatching the system in order to accommodate that bilateral schedule without violating transmission constraint would be $40. Okay? So the other takeaway from this slide is that the LMP at a location is not necessarily equal to the bid of any single supplier. So it's not the bid of the last generator, for example, or generator segment that is dispatched within a zone. You've probably all seen pictures of or gradients of LMPs for systems where the LMPs vary over all the nodes on the system. And that's because of the interaction of parallel flows with transmission constraints. So next slide, please. So just to continue in that vein, another takeaway here is that the LMP can differ between two locations, say B and C, even if there's no limit reached on the line between those locations. Even if there is not, and remember here, we're really looking at the contingency constraint picture, but I mean, it's not something to get stuck on. But the point is that you don't have to literally have a transmission limit binding in order to see price differences between two locations. In some cases, you can get constraints like interface constraints that can divide parts of the system in two or can create load pockets. And in this case, you might have, you might see that there are LMP differences that look like they're on two sides of a constraint. But more generally, transmission constraints don't divide the system neatly in two, and LMPs differ at many locations. Next slide, please. So under an LMP system, the energy settlements for suppliers and loads, as I said before, it can be for their full dispatch or just for the balancing energy that they might supply, and this depends on the market design. Suppliers are paid the LMP at their transmission bus, and loads pay the LMP at their location, and in most markets, the loads are charged on a zonal basis. In many markets, there's an optionality to be charged on a nodal basis, but the default is zonal. Transmission users, in other words, those scheduling transmission between 2 points, pay transmission congestion charges. The transmission congestion charge is the difference between the LMP at a withdrawal location less the LMP at the injection location. And as I had mentioned before, you can think of this as the lowest cost of the redispatch on the system based on the flexible bids and offers in order to reliably accommodate the transaction. Now, if you had an incompatibility in which transmission users paid a transmission congestion charge that weren't calculated based on this formula, it could cause problems with the control of the transmission system. And we actually saw that in PJM during the 1999, in the very early days of its operation, when they didn't have LMP, and the charge for transmission use differed than the charge for transmission, rather than the charge for congestion. And what you can get in that kind of a situation is you can get an incentive to schedule bilateral transactions, say, if the congestion charge is less than this LMP difference, that could overwhelm the ability of the system operator to balance the system, because, and this could occur if the charge for transmission were incompatible with the cost of the redispatch necessary to accommodate the schedules for the transaction. Okay, next slide, please. So this is, again, this is just a summary, and you can grade me on whether I covered the takeaways. But again, just the flow here is to explain, or hopefully to communicate how reliable transmission operation naturally encounters transmission congestion due to parallel flow and reliability constraints. In all but a few places that I know of, transmission systems aren't built out in order to be free of congestion in all possible dispatch situations. In other words, to be free of congestion given any possible situation of load on the system or available supply. Building transmission is just too expensive to do that. So instead, the transmission system operators recognize that there will be congestion sometimes due to parallel flow and reliability constraints, and they manage that through economic dispatch based on the voluntary offers of suppliers and loads. Suppliers typically have the alternative to either sell energy into the energy balancing market or through bilateral transactions. The loads typically can buy energy from the balancing market or through the dispatch or through bilateral transactions. The last link here is to show that the LMPs fall directly out of and can be calculated once you know the results of the security-constrained economic dispatch and what the bids and offers were of the generators, the suppliers dispatched on the margin to balance the system. So that's the end of my presentation. Goes without saying that there are many other things that I could talk about, and we have much larger presentations that explain all of this in more detail. I think the only other thing I want to say is that I feel that the missing leg of the stool that is left out here is FTRs. So as you know, the LMP prices are known after you know what the dispatch is. So you only know the congestion price for transaction scheduling after the dispatch. And FTRs are the mechanism for enabling parties to know the price of transmission in advance of the dispatch instead. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
This is Pam, and thank you, Susan, for that excellent presentation. I certainly learned a lot and had some concepts, I think, illuminate through your walkthrough. I think it's a good opportunity to pause and ask some clarifying questions if anyone has them. If you have a comment or a question, you can press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue. We also have shorter presentations from Lindsay and Dawn to cover congestion as it stands today in the EIM and the ISO markets. So I'll see if there are any questions before moving to Lindsay or Dawn.
We do have one question on the line. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Vijay with WI. Thanks, Pam, for arranging Susan's presentation. That was very helpful. Susan, this is really helpful. I have a question on your last slide, which is like the summary slide. Just to be clear on bullet number 2, centralized dispatch is required to manage transmission congestion and ensure reliability. I don't think you're implying, but the meaning I'm getting is, does a bilateral transaction not effectively also manage congestion? Does it have to be centralized dispatch only that can effectively negate congestion by reallocating prices? Thanks.
What I'm referring to here is that there is, by centralized, is that there is a need for a transmission system operator to look at the overall flows on the system in any dispatch and to be able to move flexible supply in order to manage congestion. And that needs to be done by one party that can look at all the flows on the transmission system at the same time. Now, a bilateral schedule, a transmission schedule, can help to alleviate transmission, and if it alleviates transmission, the congestion charge can actually be negative, and it can, which essentially means that it gets paid for alleviating congestion. But when you get down to the 5-minute basis on which dispatch or redispatch is typically done in order to manage transmission congestion, typically transmission schedules, bilateral schedules, are not arranged and cannot be arranged on such a short time step. And instead, it's flexible suppliers or even perhaps loads that are adjusted on that time step to ensure reliability.
Thank you. This is very helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Pam.
We have a couple more on the line. I believe the name on the list is Cheryl. Sure, your line is unmuted. Okay, we'll just come back to her. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Okay, sorry. My first question was actually pretty much answered by the gentleman just in front of me, or who just asked the question, but I have another one in regard to the FTRs. It sounds like that is something that you recommend as a mitigation or something that could be used in circumstances such as we're faced with where we don't have a specific market operator who is, well, we have a market operator, but it's not the transmission authority in all of the areas. So do you recommend FTRs, and would you recommend them at least for a transition period?
You know, I wish I felt that I could answer that question. I think that I don't know enough of the context behind the question and the specific ways that FTRs are being considered that you are referring to. In situations in which you have LMPs that are being used to settle to pay generation, to charge load, or to charge congestion to for bilateral transactions on in a networked system. In other words, in a system in which you don't have radial limits. I think if you have incremental transmission that people want to be able to purchase and pay for in advance, and that can be sold in advance and is typically feasible to use, then FTRs are a way to do that that are compatible with LMP settlements.
Okay, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
This is Jim Farrar, TID. Could you relate that congestion value that you talked about to a term I've heard the ISO use, the shadow price at a node, or the shadow price of a constraint?
Sure, those are all different things. So the congestion price is the difference in the locational price between two locations. It's exactly the formula that is at the bottom of one of these pages, at the bottom of page 16. That's I call it congestion charge here. You can call it congestion price. That is the price difference between two locations. The shadow price of a constraint is basically the marginal cost of managing the flow on an individual transmission limit. And congestion charges, or the congestion price again that I stated at the bottom of page 16, is basically made up of, or it's comprised of, pieces that relate to the cost of all of the binding transmission constraints in any dispatch. So the shadow prices of all of the transmission constraints are part of the mathematical formula that goes into calculating both LMPs, LMPW, and LMPI, as well as the congestion charge. They're kind of subcomponents, because you could have several transmission constraints binding in any dispatch. So if a transaction between a point of an injection and point of withdrawal causes flows over, say, 2 different binding transmission constraints, this transmission charge, stated on page 16, can consist of components associated with the cost of congestion on both of those constraints, or on all the constraints that are binding, depending on the degree to which the transaction causes flows on those constraints. Now, again, I just want to add the caveat that this equation and what I'm saying here is leaving aside the fact that there are other components to the LMPs having to do with marginal losses and sometimes trade-offs between energy and reserves. But those are kind of the next level of complication and explaining what LMPs are.
Thank you.
Welcome.
There are no further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, Susan, as we proceed through these conversations, it reminds me of just how complex the algorithms that underpin even the energy imbalance market are. And when we break up and just have even a deep dive into one of these concepts, that there's a large interplay between not only congestion but also the economic dispatch and the co-optimization of the different components of the balancing services.
Right.
So thank you. This has been a very interesting presentation. I hope we have more questions after we hear from Lindsay and then Dawn. So I'll turn it over to Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Schleckaway from Pacificorp, and I'm going to present today on the EIM, how congestion rent is currently conducted in the EIM. So you can move to the next slide. Okay, so first I wanted to talk about the marginal cost of congestion. That's what CAISO calls the component of congestion within the LMP. And I have taken a screenshot of the CAISO LMP map and selected a node within the CAISO region. And there you can see the breakdown of all of the different components within the LMP, and congestion, which is that first component at $7.17, is just one component. I'm just trying to break this out of that LMP. So this, if you want to ever look at this map, you can see it on CAISO's main page, real time, to see how it changes with each 5-minute interval. And also, the congestion component reflects the congestion that is occurring at that location and is an indication of where the optimization values generation in that area. Okay, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, so first I wanted to provide an example of how congestion works in the EIM, and I'm not doing this at the node level. This is at the balancing authority area level, so it's a much higher view, and it's more looking at the interties between the balancing authority areas. That's the main focus. It's not a nodal congestion like was just discussed. Okay, so in this simple example, I'm considering no losses occurring, and in this specific example, it's without congestion, so it's just basically setting up the two balancing authority areas. And what you can see is that there's a 250 megawatt limit, and that's basically the transfer limit between the two balancing authority areas. And I'm showing a transfer of 200 megawatts from balancing authority area 2 into 1 to serve the load that's 200 megawatts in balancing authority area 1. So that generator 1 and BA1 is actually not running in this example. And so the LMPs are consistent between the two areas at $30 because there's no congestion separating the LMPs. And so they're just the same between the two BAs. And then I have broken it out into the settled energy and this little table that you see here to the bottom right of the slide. And this you can basically see, you can go through the calculation, but you can basically see that there isn't any leftover revenue that needs to be allocated amongst the BAs. The generator and load, if you were to sum up what the loads were charged and what the generators were paid, it equals 0, so there's nothing to allocate here. So we can move on to the next slide where there is an example with congestion. Okay, so using the same example, you can see that the load was increased in balancing authority area 1 by 150 megawatts, and the transfer limit remains the same at 250 megawatts. The transfers increase from balancing authority area 2 to balancing authority area 1 by 50 megawatts, but do not exceed the transfer limit. Generator 2 supplies the energy for the load and balancing authority area 2, and 250 megawatts of generator 3 supplies energy to the load and balancing authority area 1. And in this example, there is an LMP in balancing authority area 2, which is $30, which is the marginal cost to serve energy to that load in that area. And then generator 1 has to generate in this scenario to supply energy to the load in balancing authority area 1. So that's why the LMP in balancing authority area 1 is $50. So the marginal cost of congestion in this scenario between the two balancing authority areas is $20. So you can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is I've kept the example there, but this is just focusing more on the settled energy between the two balancing authority areas. So the load and generator generation settled energy are shown in the top 3 rows. And then the balancing authority area total settled energy is calculated in the 4th row. And then the congestion revenue I've calculated in that last row. So basically, you can see that the balancing authority area total, so just summing up load 1 and generator 1 and BA1, you get to $12,500 that was charged as a sum in that BA, and then I'm just basically summing it up in balancing authority area 2. And so if you then sum everything together between the two areas, you get the leftover amount that needs to be allocated amongst the BAs or amongst the participants. Okay, you can move on to the next slide. Okay, so current EIM congestion allocation. First off, the congestion revenue flows to a neutrality account, which is called the real-time congestion offset account. The congestion that occurs within a balancing authority area is allocated to the EIM entity of that balancing authority area. So basically meaning if congestion is occurring internally to that BA, it goes to that EIM entity. And then the congestion that occurs between EIM entities, so between two EIM entities, it's typically split between amongst them 50-50. However, there are exceptions to this rule, but it typically is split at a 50-50 allocation. And then the congestion revenue is collected on all the constraints, which could be an intertie scheduling limit, an EIM transfer limit, or a rate of change constraint. Okay, you can move to the next slide. Okay, so this slide gets to the exceptions of how congestion revenue is allocated, or how congestion is allocated amongst the EIM entities. So first, there is external interties, and I want to say it used to be a 50-50 split between the BAs, and that's until there was a stakeholder initiative called EIM Enhancements Phase 2, and so that's where I got all this information. That's when a lot of this change in these exceptions came into play. So I've referenced that in my presentation. If you want to do more digging on what occurred in that stakeholder initiative, you can go there, which is on the next slide, but I'll talk about these exceptions. So external interties are basically, it's an interface between an EIM entity and a non-EIM entity, or where you have transfers that's going from an EIM entity to a non-EIM entity or vice versa. A non-EIM entity can enforce incremental rate of change between the 15-minute market and the 5-minute market dispatch. Or they can also enforce limits on the EIM flows. So that was one thing to note on this. But if congestion occurs in this interface or on this intertie, then 100% of the congestion rent is applied to the EIM entity that is interconnected to the non-EIM entity. And there's also rules for internal interties, which is basically an interface between two EIM entities. That could be one EIM, that includes CAISO in that EIM entity category. Or it's also I guess a scenario where you have one EIM entity wheeling through a non-EIM entity to get to another EIM entity. So that's the other situation that this applies to. The interchange scheduling limit, if it's equal to or less than the EIM transfer limit, then the congestion rent is split 50-50. So that's the scenario where you basically allocate the congestion rent equally. And in situations where you have more than one BA on one intertie and sharing those constraints, then it's a ratio share at that intertie. And then the next scenario is if the interchange scheduling limit is greater than the total EIM transfer limit, then the congestion caused by if it's congestion that's caused by the EIM transfer limit, then it's allocated 100% to the EIM entity that is providing the transmission. But if congestion was caused by the interchange scheduling limit, then it's allocated 100% to the EIM entity managing that intertie scheduling point. And again, if you want to read more about this, you can go to that stakeholder initiative. But I wanted to add the additional exceptions that also apply to this split of congestion allocation. There are other situations. For instance, there's actually 3 other situations that can occur of how congestion may be split up differently. So if an EIM entity fails the flex ramp sufficiency test in a downward direction, then 100% of that congestion revenue is allocated to that EIM entity. And another exception is if an EIM entity has a contingency event or is isolated, an isolated BA event where they kind of have to isolate themselves out of the market, then again, they're getting the 100% of that congestion revenue. So those are the other exceptions. And there was one other thing I wanted to note with this. All of these constraints, the congestion is allocated to the entity that and where the constraint is located. So if the constraint is located in, for the example, in balancing authority area 2 rather than balancing authority area 1, then that would determine where the allocation would go depending on this interchange scheduling limit, as long as it was greater than or equal to, or sorry, as long as it was greater than the EIM transfer limit. And I know that's very, that's all I had, and you can, the next slide just shows the references. And I know it's still kind of confusing, but that's why I wanted to post all these references in case anybody wants to read a little bit more about it.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm sure there are questions, but I think we'll hold those until we hear from Dawn.
Good afternoon, everyone. So as Susan mentioned, you know, many of the Eastern ISOs have financial transmission rights, or FTRs. In the CAISO, we have congestion revenue rights that we use to distribute the congestion revenues that are collected through the day-ahead market. And so I'm going to go through a very high-level presentation on our congestion revenue rights design. I would note that there's lots of computer-based training available that can go into more detail on this, as well as a very detailed business practice manual. So in our market, load-serving entities or other market participants can acquire congestion revenue rights, and they use that to offset their day-ahead congestion cost. So assuming in this example, load had contracted with generator 1 on a forward basis, they're in essence having your generator's locational marginal price at $30 in this example, but their load is paying $35. And so what they do to hedge the exposure to that price differential due to congestion is they would nominate and receive a congestion revenue rights, which would pay them the $5 difference for every megawatt between this source and sink pair. There's two types of congestion revenue rights products in our market. The first is what we call obligations. And so they're paid the congestion if it's in the same direction as the flow, and they're charged in the opposite direction. Again, they're trying to get that price at the generator. So it could be higher or lower, but they forward contracted and they want the price at the generator. This is allocated and auctioned to market participants. This is predominantly what we have with regards to congestion revenue rights. We do have another one, which is an option, which is where you're only paid, so you're never going to be charged. And this is really for people who have brought merchant transmission to the system, but are not having their costs recovered through the transmission access charge of the CAISO. There's also some timing and terms of the congestion revenue rights. So there's 3 terms in our market. On an annual basis, we will allocate and auction off seasons, and it's really just Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. We also then have in our markets a long-term congestion revenue rights product that allows them to extend it for a total of 10 years. And then we have a monthly process where January, February, March, we go through the same process again to where we allocate and auction off congestion revenue rights. And then there's 2 flavors of them. There's a peak and an off-peak time of use. So as I said earlier, we have annual and monthly processes whereby we distribute these to market participants. The first step in our process is to allocate to our load-serving entities. So load-serving entities will nominate source sink pairs representing where they intend to where they've forward contracted and plan to serve their loads. There's no charge to acquire these congestion revenue rights. We do a simultaneous feasibility test, and this is so that we can fairly allocate CRs between load-serving entities, because you may have them two load-serving entities asking for the same source sink pair, for example. and that's an equitable way to then distribute the overall transmission system to them. After we've completed that allocation to the load-serving entities, we then have an auction where market participants that are certified to participate in the auction can also participate along with the load-serving entities. And in this auction, they actually bid to buy or sell various source sync pairs. We then do a simultaneous feasibility test, but this time the objective is to maximize the bid-based value of all the CRRs. And then when we have these auction proceeds, anything above where we're able to sell additional given counterflows, et cetera, those do accrue through to the CRR balancing account, which at the end of the month is allocated to measured demand. We also made a recent change where we don't guarantee full funding. So in the example I'm showing here, and you can have instances where in the congestion revenue rights time frame, in the monthly time frame, the model used to clear the awards of the congestion revenues may have a higher transmission limit than what is actually utilized in the day-ahead market because of an outage, for example. And this can result in shortfalls in that you have CRRs who have rights to the congestion difference between a source sync pair that is greater than what could actually flow over it and was collected through the day-ahead market. So what we do now is, to the extent that occurs, then we take a pro rata share of that shortfall and apply that to all of the CRR holders that have impact on that day-ahead limit. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Again, there's lots more detail on it, but this is how we are able to distribute those congestion revenues on a day-ahead time frames to our market participants. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Lindsay and Don. I think we are ready to take any remaining questions that you may have. Again, press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the queue.
Hey, Pam, it's Tony.
Go ahead, Tony.
So I know we have limited time, Don, and I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole here, but if I understand this correctly, if I'm a load-serving entity right now in CAISO and I'm allocated, therefore, some CRRs and I nominate in the allocation, just leave it at that, a source sync pair, say from an intertie point to, Palo Verde to a Southern California or Cobb to a Northern California withdrawal point, I'm receiving some percentage of that delta that represents the congestion and therefore the energy price differential between the injection and the withdrawal, right?
Correct.
As we think about markets, and as Lindsay has described, that's not the way it's done in EIM, and we don't have CRRs for real-time markets. Am I capturing it? It's trying to balance today. I'm that CRR holder. I see that congestion flows to me, or charge goes away from me. But in any case, I presumably nominate something that I would find valuable to my overall position. If we do something different than that, you're going to have money moving around, right, between market participants, and is that what we've got to grapple with as we look forward to how to deal with this in EDAM?
Yeah, I think that in EDAM, you're really talking about the day-ahead time frame where you have because loads participating in the day-ahead time frame. They forward contract with supply. We want them to offer that supply in so that it potentially get redistributed most economically, but then we want them to still maintain their congestion hedges that they had by forward contracting with their suppliers. And so this is one approach whereby you can equitably distribute those congestion revenues to the load-serving entities within your balancing authority area. I would also note that we do have a process to where out-of-balancing authority area load-serving entities can also nominate and receive congestion revenue rights similar to internal load-serving entities by prepaying our wheeling access charge for the month. and then they in essence can get the congestion hedge from their generator located in our balancing authority area to the export point.
So looking at options for doing that for allocating their rents, you know, we're sort of used to the CRRs, and they've certainly been not without battles. And it seems to me I'm just trying to think through what's the issue we're going to be wrestling with in EDAM, and doing something other than using CRRs is one thing, but you know, taking those same day-ahead transactions and then allocating the price differentials or the congestion rents in a different way, it would be really helpful to sort of try to quantify that, if it's even possible, because that's going to be a big driver, I think, in how people view and whether they get comfortable with the market proposals.
Yep, no, this is why we're tackling this in Bundle 1. It's very tightly coupled with how you make transmission available.
This is Pam. Are there more questions in the queue?
We do. We have one question.
Excellent.
Hi, this is Laura Trelease with the Public Generating Pool. And first I wanted to just compliment Pam and all the speakers. This was a very useful meeting and learned a lot today. So thank you for lining up all the excellent presenters. I have a question back on Lindsay's presentation on slide 7 and trying to just understand a little bit of the history and the logic between why in some instances on this second bullet about internal interties, why in some instances the congestion rent is split 50-50, while in other instances it's sort of this all or nothing. And maybe that's a question for Lindsay or for Dawn about just some of the history and logic behind that.
So this is Dawn.
Yep. I'll let you answer it, Dawn.
Okay. So, you know, the key here is that we're not explicitly settling the transfers as an export from one balancing authority area and an import to another balancing authority area. And since this is really more of an offset that needs to be out, that we need to come up with an accurate sort of, as best we can, we basically then come up with the sort of the simplified approach where we split it 50-50 when there's sort of two parties and they're both impacted basically the same by that transfer limit binding. On the ones where there's multiple transfer limits and an intertie scheduling limit, then you're trying to divide it that way so that you can get it as closely as possible split equitably. But it's really a function of in the EIM that we're not settling these transfers as explicit imports and exports.
Yeah, and I guess the question is posed, and as it was posed in the EDAM workshop, are there interties where you have sort of systemic congestion where one side of the path congests first and receives the 100% of the congestion rent?
Okay.
If that's so, is that so? Just kind of that's
why I think in the day-ahead time frame, it's something you want to look at and understand, given the volumes are significantly higher in the day-ahead time frame.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks.
At this time, there are no further questions.
Well, this is Pam, and I think I have one final question for Susan, which really avoiding the market design specifics, but trying to think more about principles as we are revisiting the role of congestion and congestion cost allocation as we think about expanding to the day-ahead market. Are there some concepts or principles that you think we should keep in mind as we are struggling with these design elements?
You know, I've worked with ISOs. I've worked with the 3 different ISOs, or maybe more, on the transition to LMP markets, where they had to make decisions about whether they're going to have FTRs and how they're going to determine, or CRRs rather, how they're going to determine who gets them and for how long. And I think the important things are things like you want to try to avoid cost shifts as you make this kind of transition, and that can be difficult because it entails figuring out what people today have a right to. You know, do they have a right to transmission to serve their own load? Do they have a long-term transmission contract that needs to be honored? And to sort out what those existing rights are was very difficult in these past efforts. Sometimes there were difficult steps because the actual historic, or say existing use of the transmission system depended on counterflow, say provided by a party to serve its own load, and that party couldn't be depended on to provide that counterflow in the future. So that might lead to a reduction in the transmission rights that some people have today. So that step of figuring out what people really have today and to what extent is that going to give them a right to nominate CRRs in the future, and what will be the priorities in that nomination process, and how do you solve infeasibilities. Those were the really big steps. You also want to pay attention to not over-allocating the CRRs. Like Don mentioned in his presentation, you can have shortfalls in which the amount of congestion rents collected isn't sufficient, and that you want to design the system so that you don't have too much of that. And there are ways of doing that that can involve selling, being conservative in what CRRs you allocate on a longer term basis, and then maybe making more available as you get to shorter and shorter term CRRs. I think in the early days there was a lot of interest in having CRRs or FTRs that were options rather than obligations, because, as Don explained, with options, they'll never entail a payment. They're more like transmission rights today, where you can use them if you want to, but if you don't use them, you don't suffer any potential liability. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you provide CRR or FTR options. But the fact is that they chew up a lot of room on the grid. And, we developed these methodologies, and, PJM, you can bid for FTR options, but pretty much nobody does because they're very expensive. So I would say that, you might go down a rabbit hole where people want the CRRs or the FTRs to be options rather than obligations, but I think experience has shown that that's kind of hard to do, and, it can have some consequences that people have kind of voted with their feet and don't seem to like very much. I'm trying to think. I think revenue adequacy is always an issue, and I don't know. That's probably enough for now.
Well, that's very helpful, and some good insight from past history with other markets.
Mm-hmm.
And we have reached our 5 o'clock stopping point with just barely a minute to spare. Thank you all for participating in the first online-only version of the EIM Regional Issues Forum and for everyone's flexibility and patience as we are responding to the situation with the coronavirus. I hope that our next meeting in Boise will be in person, but if not, I would definitely appreciate feedback on this format and any suggestions in making it more interactive and continue to work for stakeholders. And with that concludes today's event, and I appreciate everyone's time and questions. Thank you.